This is my dog Yoda. And this time we're going over conditionals on the condition that you subscribe to me. Alright, let's get started. We're going over conditionals in Ansible on one condition that you like and subscribe to the channel. So conditionals, what are they? If you're familiar with programming languages, programming methodologies, you know we have these things called conditionals, not conditionables, conditionals. They are a way of saying only do something when a certain condition is true or false, or only do something when something is the way we have defined, right? So we have when statements generally in Ansible are the most common conditionals, right? We can say only run a specific task in Ansible when a certain condition is met. So we can define a variable and we can say only execute this task when that variable from a previous task was present, or we can say only execute this task if this host has a certain fact that we've gathered during the gathered facts stage. So if it is maybe a Red Hat system, we want to run this task, or if it's a Red Hat system, we want to skip this task, right? So if we head on over the documentation, they've got really good documentation on their website for Ansible on conditionals. So we've got the when statement, we've got loop conditionals. You can load your custom facts, applying with a when to roles and includes. So you can only have to run roles when certain conditions are met. You can import conditional imports, selecting files and templates based on variables, and then registering variables, right? So generally how you're going to do conditionals in Ansible is the majority of the time is always going to be with a when statement, right? And this is a really good example right here. Sometimes you want to skip a particular step on a particular host. This is something that is simple as not installing a certain package if the operating system is of a particular version, right? So what they're saying down here in these tasks, right, is that they only want to execute this command when the Ansible OS family, which is a fact gathered during the gathered facts task on a playbook run, equals a Debian, right? And if it is not Debian, it will just skip over this. So right off the bat, let's start kind of getting into conditionals and seeing them in action by using the method that we only run a certain task based on the results of a previous task within the same play, right? So I've got the NGINX deployment playbook in front of me that we used in earlier videos. We've been using the same files throughout all these videos. And if you remember in the first video, I ran this against management 01 node on my home lab. So NGINX is already installed on my management 01 node, right? So what I am going to do is I'm going to create a conditional that checks to see if NGINX is already installed on the nodes I'm running against. And if it is not, it will install it. And if it is, it will skip that task and not install it, right? So if I come over to my NGINX playbook, I need to find a way to discover if NGINX is installed or not. That way Ansible can decide if it wants to execute the tasks based on a conditional that we're going to give it. So you could do this in many ways, right? You could say, I want to check to see if var tutorial exists. And if it does not, then I know that NGINX isn't installed. At least for me, the way I want it configured, right? Someone else may have installed NGINX on the system, but not created var tutorial, and thus you are going to attempt to install NGINX based on the conditional that this directory and file exists, when in fact they don't exist, but NGINX is installed. So you just have to be careful about how you define your checking for whether or not a certain state exists, or the conditional may not work out the way you want it to, right? So generally you want to find a way, the most common way to figure out if something is to check your conditional, right? And I would say on a Linux distribution, right, you would probably do a systemctl status NGINX, and if this is installed, it's gonna tell you, you know, if the NGINX server is running or not. And if it tells you nothing, then you know you don't have NGINX on the system at all. So I'll start with a task. Check to see if NGINX is installed or not, right? And you can do this multiple different ways. Again, you can do it by a path to see if it exists that you expect to exist. You can do it by a package you expect to be installed, or you can do it by a service you expect to be running at all, right? So let us do a system. Nope. We'll do a shell command, right? And we will systemctl status NGINX, right? So we saw here in the terminal that it should output unit NGINX service not found if NGINX is not installed at all. Versus if it is installed, it'll tell us if it's active and running, or just attempt to start, or if just failed not running, right? So I could register this as a variable. So based on the shell, I'll take the shell command output of systemctl status NGINX, and I'll register that as a variable as NGINX status, right? And now I need to, I'm actually going to use debug to see what that status is during the playbook run, so I can actually have that output so I can see what it's going to be myself. Var NGINX status standard out, and I'm going to include a verbosity just to give it even more verbosity of 2. So now what we want to do is we only want to run our tasks: install NGINX, make the directory, create the index.html, and restart NGINX when the NGINX status says something along the lines of NGINX.service could not be found, right? So I could say, you know, only run these tasks when the variable is not defined, but because there was something output here to standard out, technically a variable will be defined. It just won't be defined the way I want it to. So it will still attempt to install. So what I need to take into account, and the when goes in line with the module name. So it's not part of the parameters of that module. It's part of the task itself. So what I could do is I could take the NGINX status dot standard out, and I could use the dot find option at the end of the variable, and what it's going to do is it's going to look for a string that I define inside that variable. And the way I do that is I take parentheses, single quotes, and then if I want to look for could not be found, then NGINX, this when statement will only be run, and then we specify not equal to -1. So now NGINX is only going to install when the NGINX status that is output to the terminal standard out contains the string could not be found, right? So that gets rid of the scenario where maybe NGINX is installed but it's not running, so the service has failed. So then we would take this when statement and we would copy it, and we would apply it to each different task. And that way none of these tasks get run if NGINX is not installed. So then we'll save. So now I'm going to make sure my host that I want to run it against is valid. So we have kHworker01, and we know NGINX is installed on kHworker01 from the first video in this episode 1 of this little series I'm doing. So NGINX should not install on this host. So if I go ahead and let's see, what was the name of this playbook here? This is NGINX deployment.yaml. So I'll go ahead and run this against kHworker01. We will give our become password because we put the -K at the end of our Ansible -playbook run. So we're checking to see if NGINX is installed or not, right? We did a debug. Looks like we didn't get anything out of that, actually. All right, so I had a bit of a hiccup there. As you can see in our previous plays, you can go scroll past my debugging. The debug module skipped and it did not work. So I just adjusted our syntax here in the way this is done, right? So instead of debug being a separate task, I actually turned it into, like, I had -debug here, and now it is actually a proper task using the debug module, var NGINX status defined, right? So I reran it, and now, you know, it was always skipping the way we wanted to, but we didn't get to see the variable, so we didn't know if it was working the way we wanted it to. So now, when I reran it, gather facts, check to see if NGINX is installed or not, registers the variable, we debug the variable out. So because this particular system has NGINX installed, we got all this text here to let us know that NGINX is running on the system. So we skipped the rest of these tasks, right? Because we told Ansible, hey, search the NGINX status variable and look for the string could not be found. And if it is not, if you can't find this string, then you should install Ansible. But if you can't find this string, then Ansible is installed. So skip this task. If you do find this string, run this task, right? So now that we've assigned our conditionals to each task, I got to introduce you to a better way to do this, because just copying and pasting the same when statement to each task over and over and over is not it's not a viable way to do things. So in Ansible, we have what's called the block module. So actually, let me see if I can pull that up here. Block module, Ansible. Block module. So blocks create a logical group of tasks, basically, right? So what that means, if you look here in Ansible's example, they use the block module in a task, and then they nest a bunch of tasks within that block module task. And that way, all of the parameters that belong at the task level, so the block module level, get applied to every task nested within that block task, if that makes sense, right? So we don't have to define this when statement over and over and over. So we'll actually go ahead and get rid of that. We'll get rid of that. We can just define it once, as long as we've nested our tasks within the block module. And that means if we ever have to go back and change our conditionals, we only have to change them in one place, and it's a lot neater. So let's reorganize this real quick. So we need a task here called, for our block module, let's say block to install NGINX, right? We're using the block module. So now I just have to move all these over. Everything that I want nested by one. Or one tab, you know, YAML format. Now I can define my when statement. Make sure that's in line. Yep. When. And let's paste that. So now this should apply to every task nested inside this block statement right now. Boop. So now if I rerun this, again against K8's worker 01, the one with NGINX already installed. And I'm gonna adjust myself here. It should work the same way it was working before, but now we've only defined the when statement in one place. And voila. Now, I need to test this against the host NGINX is not installed on. at the same time, just to make sure it's working the way I want, right? So I'll change the host here from one host to a group of hosts. So I have a host group in my inventory called workers. Ooh, I'm using this inventory, so I have a children group called workers. So all three of these hosts are going to be checked for NGINX, and it should not install it on this one, but it should install it on these two. So let's go back to NGINX deployment, and let's run that one more time. And we failed out actually on 2 of our hosts here. So this is a good important thing to remember, right? So it says systemctl status, NGINX server could not be found. So that's what we wanted, right? We knew that was going to happen, but why did it fail? Well, it failed because this is technically considered a failable error, right? So what I need to do in this task is I need to put ignore errors true. Or is it yes? I don't know. We'll find out. And now, even if there is an error, and ignore errors, sorry. Even if there is an error, it will continue on to the next host, but it should still register the variable and debug it and go through these steps. So we're gathering facts on all 3 hosts. We are checking. And what happened there is we got the service could not be found, right? Service could not be found. Service could not be found on our 2 nodes. But why did we skip on these 2 nodes? That is the question, because they don't have NGINX. That based on the conditional we've defined, NGINX should have been installed, right? So do we actually have could not be found somewhere in this output? Could not be found. Could not be found, right? So we do. So why didn't it work is the real question. This is actually defined in standard error. So what if I search standard error, could not be found for this string, right? Because technically that's what it says right there. Standard error, unit NGINX service could not be found. Aha, that was it. So now it's working as expected. So I tried to use standard. What happened there is I tried to use standard out, and I tried to find. So I did my variable dot standard out dot find. So I was telling Ansible, search for this string in the standard out. Well, in the standard out, it's empty right here. You see these quotation marks? It's empty. But standard error, which is what I'm getting, had the string that I was looking for. So I actually just defined, I told Ansible to look in the wrong place, and that's why that was failing out. So I'm gonna let this run, and then we'll come back. Then we see that engine. Oh, there it goes. Actually, you're gonna see this run. So, what did we have here? We had some errors. Ansible loop var item change false undefined, title is undefined. So this happened because I didn't define the variables for these other 2 nodes in the host vars, right? No, that's not where it's looking. This is coming from inventory. I didn't define a title here for these 2, but you get the gist. It didn't run it against 0.1 because NGINX was installed. and it tried to run it against, and it would have successfully had I actually done my job and made sure I had the right variables in place, installed NGINX on node 2 and 3. So that's an example of using conditionals to only execute tasks based on a check you have set, based on a previous task that you said, check to see if NGINX is installed, and if it is not, then run these tasks and install it. And we also went over the block module, a very handy module to logically group a bunch of tasks, so you don't have to define the same when statement over and over and over for every task. You just define it in one place, and you nest your tasks within the block module. So there's one other, well, there's multiple different scenarios you'd use conditionals, but another good one that I want to go over is executing commands based on the operating system, right? So we know that Ansible, you can gather facts at runtime, so it does gather facts, and it gathers a bunch of different information. It gathers what NICs are installed, what IP addresses and MAC addresses do they have, what partitions do you have, are they using, well, how big are these partitions, and it also gathers what operating system it is, what the major and minor version are, and what architecture it is, what kernel version you're currently running, right? So we can use these facts gathered at runtime to easily define when conditionals. Sorry, only run this when the operating system is a certain operating system, right? So real quick, let's go over that. So I'm actually going to, still using the block module, get rid of this here. And if you're curious, right, and you want to see which facts you're going to pick up for a host, right, you can actually run a command to see the facts per particular host. So you're going to want to do Ansible, and then you're going to want to do the host name, and this host has to be in an inventory you're going to define next. So I want kits worker 01, and I want -i inventory.yaml inventory 2. Let's just do inventory, and then you're going to want to do -m for module, because this is how you ad hocly specify a module without using a playbook. And we're going to do ansible.built-in.setup, and this is going to output all the facts that Ansible would normally gather using the gather facts task. And I forgot to specify. No, I don't have to. I should not have to specify. And it's going to take a minute for those to come back. And there's a lot of them, as you can see. But here we go. I have all the facts that Ansible would have gathered at runtime for this host. So let's look for distribution is what I'm looking for. Actually, I'm going to run that again, but I'm actually going to output this to a file called facts.yaml. And we're going to watch, I think we should watch this populate live. And that way I can parse through this file easily. There we go. So now I can actually search using Visual Studio Code for distribution. All right. So here's my facts about the operating system for that host, kitsworker01. So the distribution is Ubuntu. And let's take, let's see. So let's put this side by side actually. So when you're defining a fact gathered by Ansible as a conditional, you always have to start off with Ansible_facts. So when Ansible_facts, and then you have to use this syntax here, right? Dot distribution, single quotes, is equal to Ubuntu, right? So we're saying Ansible gather these facts, and I want, so this one right here after Ansible underscore is what you need to put in these brackets, right? So if I want to say get the distribution version, I would replace distribution over here with distribution version, not the whole Ansible underscore distribution version. Same for, it's the same syntax with all these facts, right? And then these exact string here, it is case sensitive, so Ubuntu, right? So these tasks should only run on when the host is an Ubuntu system. So let's go ahead and get rid of our conditional from earlier. I'm gonna go ahead and close this facts here. So I don't, actually it's not gonna matter if this goes off or not, because we're no longer we're no longer defining whether or not we're gonna run our tasks based on whether or not Ansible is already installed or not. So now that I've defined KH worker 01, Ansible is going to attempt to install NGINX on this host, whether NGINX is already installed or not, because I'm no longer checking to see if NGINX is installed or not. Now I'm checking to see if I want to only run these tasks when a certain operating system is met. In this case, Ubuntu. So we're running against KH worker 01. It's gonna do all these steps here. It should not skip them because this is an Ubuntu system. And we're trying to make a directory. It already exists. We're trying to create a file. It already exists, so we're okay. We're gonna restart NGINX anyway. And there we go. Now, if I change this to a different operating system, say Red Hat, and then I run this, the string for the operating system distribution no longer matches, so this isn't going to run. Well, it's going to run, but it's going to skip over the Ubuntu, over the task defined here in the block, not nested within the block module. And there we go, we're skipping. So that was a quick, very useful way to use conditionals to only run a certain task or group of tasks when a certain condition that you've defined in an earlier task, such as a variable, exists or not, or contains a certain string. We went over the block module, how to use the block module to logically group a bunch of tasks. So you only have to define the parameters for certain parameters for those tasks once and not multiple times. And we went over using conditionals gathered during the gathered facts task when an Ansible playbook runs to only run a task when a certain distribution is present.